Hello, in this video, I'm going to introduce you to promises in JavaScript. By the end of this video, you should be comfortable using promises. Let's get started. Welcome back. Promises in JavaScript can be very confusing and it takes time to understand how they work. By the end of this tutorial, you should get a new insight or a deeper understanding of how to use promises in your day-to-day coding. Let's begin now. So what's a promise? A promise is an object first that represents the eventual outcome of an asynchronous operation. This simply means like when you're making an asynchronous kind of operations, you expect them they are going to work or they will fail. So that kind of outcome is represented by a promise. A promise will have different kind of states. It will have either fulfilled, it's going to be successful, or it's going to fail. And in that case, if it fails, it's rejected. I'm going to take you through step by step on what you should understand about promises and how to use them, with 3 practical examples that are going to make it easier for you using promises. On my desktop, I have a VS Code instance open and, of course, a live server test the promises code we are going to write. But as always, I like to begin with some quick notes on what we are going to learn in this video. So I'll begin by the first concept, which is a promise is an object, and the object represents an outcome of either success or failure. The second thing that we need to know is promises have states, and the states can either be pending, successful, or fulfilled, or rejected. The third, handling errors when making promises. We're going to learn about a function. Since we said the promise is an object, so it means we create the object. It has a method called then. We're going to learn about catch. I think this should not be error handling. We are repeating. So let's just say promise, handling promises. Let's change this to working with promises. When you're working with promises, you need to learn about the then. For handling errors, we need to learn the catch. And I've done another very good video about try and catch on this series of JavaScript ES6 tutorials. You can check out that video in the list. Then something else we need to do for us to solidify our knowledge on promises, we need to create a basic promise example that will just be a very basic one. Then you need to look for a more practical kind of intermediate example of a promise. Finally, we need to do an advanced promise example that will include, maybe we do something like an API request. Those are the things that we are going to follow. Let's give them numbers. So this should be 1, this should be 2, this should be 3, 4, then this is 5, this is 6, this is 7. If you can master these 7 concepts, you'll be comfortable working with promises. So let's begin with the first one, explaining that a promise is an object. The best approach to explain the first, the second, the third, and the fourth points is creating a basic promise example. That's where I'm going to begin. I'm going to begin by creating a basic promise example to outline how a promise is an object, the states of a promise, how to handle promise using the then method, and handling the errors using catch. So think of a situation where we are creating operations that are delayed and they are sequential. So we would have a function that maybe would call another function, then after that's complete, then another function, that kind of an operation. So I'm going to begin by creating a basic JavaScript function. I'll name it delayed operation. Then I intend to use the set timeout function inside this function. So I'll pass here the time that I need to delay before I can execute the other sequence of events. Then in here, we begin now with the promise. The first point is a promise is an object. So we can return, in this function, we can do a return, a new object, which is a promise, just like a normal JavaScript object. Then in this object, we are going to pass a method that will now have the delay, so that this becomes a functional kind of a function that works with the promise methods then and error handling catch. So in here, I'll give the 2 promise outcomes, and the 2 promise outcomes are either resolve or reject. Then this should be a function. So I'm using the arrow syntax inside that function. Then inside this function, I'm going to create the set timeout function. And in this function, I will return the message and then I log in the console. So then, of course, for this delay to work, we need to pass it in here as the second parameter to this function. So we are creating a set timeout function. That's rather straightforward. So then in here, we can do what happens, like once we are returning the promise. So let's return a resolve. Then the resolve should have a message. We use the temporary literals, so we can give it a message, operation has been completed. That's the resolve. So that's a successful promise. Once the promise is successful, this has been completed. But suppose you'd like to input the delay here, we can add on to this and say, then we just pass in how it has been completed after how long. So maybe we can do delay, we pass in delay here. The operation has been, the first resolve of this promise is the operation has been completed after the amount of the seconds we'll input here. We can add the word after here. That's the most basic way of creating a promise. Then in here, we can say this is a state, and this state is resolved, which is successful. Then we can use this, we call this delayed operation promise. We can use this function and we can implement it by calling it, then passing in the number of seconds that we wish to wait for this message to be output uh, either on the screen or anywhere. Because that's the resolve, we can log it. Then we'll also extend this by now, since we now have the promise, using the error handling method of try and catch. So down here, we begin now the other point of handling the promise, working with the promise now, because we've looked at creating the promise. So this which is an object. So this is how you would create a promise. Then we've looked at the state, like this is the resolved state. Then we look at working with the promise using then and catch in the next phase. We now need to call this function. Then we pass in the number of seconds we need to wait, maybe milliseconds. That 2000 means 2 seconds. So this we are telling delayed operation wait for seconds. That's equivalent to 2 seconds. Then after you wait for 2 seconds, then, so that the method, then what? So then give us the results. So in here, we do something like we can call this results, then it's a function. Then in here, we can now we just console log. We log the resolve, what has happened. So we just log the results. So that's the first thing. So simply like we are doing, if our promise is successful, is resolved, after this amount of time, log that on the console. Then what next? We now need to deal with if we are doing a sequence of events, like this is the first one, we are waiting for 2000 seconds, then what next? Maybe the next would be, let's wait for 2000 milliseconds, sorry. Then let's wait for another maybe 1500, which or 1000 or sequence of events. In here we can do, because we would like to add another then and do something else, we would call in here the function again. So we call this function again inside here. But now we change this. For how long should we wait? Maybe let's wait for 15. So this again is wait for, that will be 1.5 seconds. Then after I wait for that, what next? So I've waited for 1.5 seconds. Again, then do what? Then do something. Then after I'm done with then I'll do catch. So that's how you would create a sequence of events. So let's go step by step. So in here, again, I'll do results, then it's a function, then it gives me back results. So just log that. These are very basic, simple example. Then since we've run it twice, the first and the second time, we now need to find if there are any errors, we catch them. So we use the catch. Then the catch takes in a parameter, which is usually the error. Then it's supposed to be a function. Then we need to close there. Then what happens with this error? I need to log this error in the console. Instead of logging it in the console, I log it to the error tab. Then I need to give it a message, which this message will be error of delayed operation. Then I pass in the error. In a step-by-step manner, we created the promise. We had the states of the promise. Then here we are dealing with working with promises. Now here, then the then method. Then we are looping. We are moving the first, the second. Then down here, we are dealing with something we call handling errors when working with promises. I would expect if I saved this, since I've already created the promise and there are no errors, suppose, I expect this to run for the first 2 seconds. Then after the first 2 seconds, it's going to run again for 1.5 seconds or 1500 milliseconds. Then if there is any error, it's going to log in the console. Once I save that, I wait for 2 seconds. Operation completed after this. The second one is undefined. So it means there is an error somewhere. So we need to look at what's happening in that, in the second one. The second one, there seems to be something that's amiss. So delayed operation, the result, there must be an error. Result is void. I find it here. This one we need to do a return. This should be return. Instead of, we are not calling, we should return it. After then, we should do a return. So we wait again, first is completed, the second is completed. So that was supposed to be returned. That's the most basic way of creating a promise in JavaScript. Now we look at this other way, a practical example, because this is not a very practical, this is just a simple example to begin using promises. Let's move to the next one, which is a practical intermediate example of a promise. Let us now look at a more practical example of using a promise in a web application. So this a practical intermediate example of a promise. We can work with something like reading a file. That can be a good example of how a promise will work. So we begin by creating a function. We call this function read file. And this function takes in one parameter, time to read file. It can just call it the time it's going to take to read a file, maybe 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and so on and so forth. Just like we did in the previous example, in here we return a new promise. So we do, a promise is an object. So, and now in here we're going to take the promise is going to take two outcomes. So it can either be resolved or rejected. Then this will be a function. In here, we now work with this delay. So we add the set new timeout. Then this is going to be a function that will now handle our resolve. So one possible outcome of this is a resolve. Then another possible outcome is a rejected, like a rejected outcome. If this is resolved, what happens? So if it's resolved, we can create a constant here. Then we say file contents will be equal to, we just give a string as this is, we are just simulating like the file is going to be read, and if the file is going to be read, we'll return a resolve, and this resolve will take in these file contents. Then if we did a reject, we'll do something like, then this reject will take in an error, should be the file. So these will kind of simulate an error when reading the file. Then in here, we need to pass in this time that's going to take to read this file here, the set timeout. So we need to pass in that time. We can get rid of this for now, so that we just return a resolve once that promise is successful. Then how do we use this function? Down here, we can do read file, we call the function. But now we pass in the time it's going to take to read the file. So we give it a number of 2000, that 2000 milliseconds, which should be 2 seconds. Then read the file for that time. Then give us the contents of the file, and this contents of this file. Then build these contents. After we log them, we can now do a catch here. We take care of this. So we just log these contents of the file. So we log, then we can now pass in the variable here in the console log these contents of the file. After the file is read, whatever is in that file. From then, we now catch the errors. So we do a catch. The catch takes in an error, and this is a function. This function will now give us the error to the console. So console.error, then we log the error, then we pass in the error. We can get the message, or we can just simply pass in the error. We're creating a function that reads a file, then you're passing the time it takes to read the file. Then inside, in the return, we are doing a promise which has a resolve and a reject. Then inside this promise object, well, we are having the set timeout that give us the resolve of the file contents. Then we are passing in the time. Now here is where we would call this implementing the promise. This would be creating the promise in the context of this tutorial. So we would be creating the promise there, then we are implementing it here. Then this would be handling the errors in the promise. So once we save this, we expect it to work. So let's see, it takes 2 seconds and it gives us the contents of the file. So that's a practical example that you would use to work with the promises. The next example, we're going to work with the live API to see how we can fetch data using a promise, and that will be the advanced example of using the promise. So let's move to that. In this third example, we are going to create a promise using a practical API, and this will be the advanced example of a promise, of how to use a promise using a live API. So this is the third example. I begin by creating a function. This function, I'll call it fetch API data and display. So this function, I'm going to use it to fetch data on a live API, then create a promise, and then render that data, possibly on our page here. So first we need to create a constant, the source of the data. I can just call it API URL. Then I need to, on my browser, I need to look for an API, like, for example, like JSON placeholder, get some data for testing. So I'll do a get request, so not a post. So I'll go with this. So this will be my URL, the source of my data. It's a string. In here, I'll do creating promise now. Now we'd like to use this data to create a promise. We create a constant, we call it fetch data. This will be equal to, we use now the fetch method, which is available on your browser, fetch API. So then we pass in the URL. If we console log this example, we just did console, we just do a return, this fetch data, not console log it. This should be a promise. If we out here now we did log this on the console, we already have created the promise. So I'd like to call this function inside here. Then close this, and you can see we now have a promise, and it has a status of pending. You can see it's going to, once it's fulfilled, you're going to see the data. Once you're able to fetch that particular data, you're going to see all the data there once we use the promise. That's a practical example of showing how to create a promise. Then we can now use the then and the catch. So I need to get rid of that. I continue with my function here. That was for just demonstrating that we have a promise. In here, I'll do just a then, the promise now. Then I need to check the response. Then I catch status errors here. So I can do an if this response is not okay, dot okay. If this response is not okay, so what do? We simply throw nil error. Then in here we can pass the message, response is not okay. That's the first guard clause to help us prevent a situation where we don't have the response from the server where we're getting the data is not okay. From then, if this is okay, we now need to return this response. But if we return this response is just going to be data. So we need to stringify it, or to convert it from the data we are reading from this to a JSON data, response.json. Then we move to our next then, so that we can now see this data in actual sense. This is the first then we do another then, our data. Here we can now the data. that we have converted to JSON string. We can now log that data. Here we converted JSON. So we are converting this data to JSON there. Up to this point, I expect now I have checked if the response is okay. Then I've converted the data to JSON. Then I have logged this data in the console. Then I need to now catch any errors and log on the console if I have any errors in my promise. So in here you can do console.error to log in the error tab. Then we pass in the error message here. Then the error, just call it fetch error message. Once we call this function, we expect if this is okay, if this is going to be okay, we expect to fetch that data. We create a promise, then we convert this data to JSON, then we grab the data here, log it on the console. So I would like to just disable this. If there are no errors, we are logging the data here, but we have undefined on line 73, undefined. This undefined is caused by, of course, we are logging on console twice because we have that log on the console and here we are logging on the console. That undefined should disappear. We've created a promise. This promise we've created by fetching the data from this URL. Then now we have used the then method on our promise. We checked if the response is okay. The response, you can also always check it on the browser XHR or the network tab. Like you can see the response here is 200 status, which means it's okay. You can also use this request tab to check. So that's beyond the scope of what we are doing here. So let's return to the console, but get rid of that. So we have already grabbed this data and we now have the data and we are running into no errors. So suppose we had this, like we just distort that. What would happen? There is an error once we distort the source of this, like this. So we expect to see error because like we are not accessing, we are not supposed to access this. This cross-origin request error occurs when like you're not allowed to access or your domain is not supposed to access that particular, or simply that thing does not exist. That kind of URL you are trying to access does not exist. So I'm back to that. That's the basic way to first of all fetch the data. Now, how do we go ahead and now display this data on our page here? We need to go back to HTML. Then we create a button. We can do a div ID fetch data button. And you can simply call it fetch data. Then we can add an input here, a div with the ID display data. Then that's going to be an empty div. We've linked these two using this style tag here. So I need to save that. Then back to my code here. After I create the promise, and now I have this function, I can now go ahead and inside here display the data. Instead of console logging this data in here, we can console log it for just debugging. We can go ahead here and display the data. So we can create a constant, display, which will be equal to get element by ID document dot get element by ID. Then we pass in the ID of that div. This is where we intend to display that a constant to display the data. We can now attach the data by simply doing display data. Then we do dot inner HTML. Then inner HTML will be equal to, we use the backtick syntax so that you can now add the data. Then we close this. So this we can begin by just even putting in the data, we have a title and then we have the body. So we can put a title first. We can do a H2 here. Then we call it fetch data. Then in here we do a p tag. This p tag we call it. Then this title we can simply pass in data. That's our object. Then this data has a title. So data dot title. Then we can repeat this for the body since it has a body, but we change this to body. Then this can be a h3 data dot body. Then I guess we are good. So we are touching this data directly to the HTML on this div, on this particular div, this div. That's where we are touching the data. Then we now need to change this to a button and save. Then we have the button here. Now we need to use this button. We attach a click event on this button such that once the data is clicked, once the button, sorry, is clicked, we get the data from the API and displayed asynchronously. So back here, we need to call this method when a button is clicked. We get rid of this first. So document dot get element by ID. Then we get the ID of the button. Then we add an event listener. Let me push it to a different line. Then this event listener takes in a click. Then this click calls this method. That's how we are going to get the data. I need to close this. That's how we are going to get the data from a click of a button. Then it should be automatically updated. If we got everything right, once we save this and click on this button, we should get the data loaded. If there are any errors, we're going to see them here. So let's save this, and there are no errors. So once we click this, the data is displayed, the title, the body, and we can as well enable this console log so that like the data is logged on the console and as well as it's displayed on the browser. So that's how we would use a promise to fetch data from an API using fetch API. So up to this point, I guess I have explained, and you picked something that you didn't know, or you've learned something new about promises and asynchronous programming in JavaScript. If you found this useful, kindly consider giving this video a thumbs up. It helps us share the message and reach out to more people. If you'd like to join our community, we appreciate. Kindly consider subscribing and sharing with your friends. Thank you for your time. I hope by the end of this video, you've learned how to use promises in JavaScript. If you enjoyed this video, kindly consider giving this video a thumbs up and do not forget to subscribe. Thank you and see you in the next video.